Not that I believe in ghosts, but if there's ever a time when you feel like you got 1,000 pair of eyes staring at you, Civil War battlefield probably tops that list. What did I get myself into? Ambrose Burnside and his battle-hungry Union Army versus Robert E. Lee and the Confederate Army of Northern Virginia. So a little bit about Ambrose Burnside. He was a Union general who fought in several different other battles leading up to Petersburg. Those other battles didn't fare so well in old Ambrose's favor. So when he came out to Petersburg, he was trying to get that golden ticket, that golden opportunity to impress his superiors, to, you know, put some honor back in his name. Well, he notified his boss, who was Ulysses S. Grant, and he sent forward a request saying that we might have an opportunity just east of Petersburg, where I'm camped out, to break through the Confederate lines and possibly take Petersburg once and for all. Looks like the mounted cavalry were here. Now, with Ambrose and his men camped out on this very ground that I'm standing on, the minutes turned to hours, the hours became days, days, weeks. Nothing was going on, except a bunch of guys sitting here staring at a bunch of guys over there. Well, any soldier will tell you that when you're bored, you get pretty innovative. Well, Ambrose had this lieutenant colonel serving under him, a fellow by the name of Henry Pleasants. Well, Henry Pleasants, he was out just, you know, in his boredom, kind of looking around, exploring around the area a little bit, and he noticed right above that hill over there, looked like a mine shaft. How would Pleasants know what a mine shaft is? Well, I'm glad you asked. See, old Pleasants, before the war, was an engineer. A mining engineer, to be exact. So he come running back, finds old Burnside, says, "Hey, General, I think I got a plan." Oh, and that plan was the bomb. Behind me, on that hill back there, way off in the distance, that was our original position. That's where Burnside was camped out for God knows how long. All of his guys were bored, nothing going on. He got that request from Colonel Pleasance about this old mine up there. Well, Burnside sent a message up to Ulysses S. Grant, his boss. You know, see what the old boss thought about it. Well, Grant, he figured, you know, the boys have been around standing in one spot for all this time. Least they could do is cure their boredom. So Burnside grabbed old Pleasance, told him to assemble a few guys. We're going to move on up. Well, moving on up ain't that easy. Ain't that hard either. But considering all that ground they had to get, wasn't easy. Because if you really pay attention, right in the middle there's a railroad line. There's a modern railroad line sitting there today, but that was the railroad line that existed back in the time of the battle. And just beyond that railroad line, about maybe 100 yards in our direction, was also a creek called Poors Creek. Poors Creek wasn't a deep creek, wasn't a wide creek, but once you crossed the creek, you had to go up about a 10-foot embankment. So, yes, it was difficult to get across that terrain, but the terrain also helped them out, gave them a favor, because it also provided ample cover that they would need to get right here where this little grassy edge is. And this grassy edge signifies their most forward line. Now, why would they put their forward line here? Well, because it's just right beyond the entrance to the mine. We're going to head over there right now. In its original state, when they first came upon it, they saw that this mine only a couple of feet. It's not good enough. Confederates are at least 500 feet. Well, they had to dig, and it took a month. Day and night they were digging, mostly by hand. Barely had any supplies to dig with. They were filling little ammo boxes or whatever they could find, cracker boxes, with dirt, and then taking it and dumping it off to the side. And they kept going and going and going and going until they reached their final length at 511 feet. That way. Now, as I'm walking the length of this tunnel, it bears question about ventilation. Well, considering they didn't have proper supplies, they had to figure out something. How to get air to the end of the tunnel. Well, every so often, from the bottom up, they would dig a ventilation shaft. And at the bottom of that ventilation shaft, they would set a fire. And at the entrance of the tunnel, they placed a canvas seal. And what that would do is the fire, where the ventilation tunnel was, served as a chimney where it sucked the air from the end of the tunnel out of the tunnel. As they kept getting further and further along with this tunnel, they dug in a manner where it angled upward. So from the beginning, it was at its lowest state. And this is just simple engineering. It's just so that when they're digging outward, the water doesn't pull where they're digging. As a matter of fact, here's part of the tunnel in its present state. Time can do things. A good month passed. Pleasance decided to order his men to stop. Well, by his estimate, they reached their target. So he ordered his men to gather their things, head back to the entrance of the mine. Standing out there in the mine, though, at the front of it, was 320 kegs of good old-fashioned American gunpowder. That's 8,000 pounds. Yeah, that'll probably do it. Well, they packed that mine to the roof and sealed it off. They sealed it off so that they could direct that explosion upwards instead of backwards towards, you know, friendlies. Well, after they got that all set up, they strung out a fuse and then they lit that sucker. Well, the order back at the camp was to have Burnside was going to have his men on standby, and as soon as that boom was heard, their men would rush and try to break through that line. Well, they lit the fuse. The fuse burned. A whole lot of time passed, nothing happened. Well, they suspected that the fuse snuffed out. Well, in probably one of the greatest hold my beer moments in American history, two guys ran into that cave and they found it. Yes, indeed, it did snuff out, because running 511 feet of fuse requires plenty of splicing, and at one of those splices the fuse fizzled out. So they reset the fuse, relit it, and all hell broke loose. It was probably the biggest boom you'd ever heard. And then that created the crater. Word over in the Confederate camp, there was rumor that they were digging a mine. Loose lips sink ships. Well, the Confederates started building counter mines to see if they could probe around, find this Union mine. Here's a few examples. The mine's over there. You missed. It goes without saying that many Confederates died in that initial explosion. You got to imagine where they were standing right above that dynamite. That was their little battery. They had cannon, men posted around, and then just in a flash, they were sent sky high. Bodies were everywhere. Bodies came back down into the crater. Well, Burnside's men, they were ordered, like I told you, to advance and charge at the moment of the explosion. Their original orders were to bypass the crater, being that the crater was the hole that they needed to punch through to get beyond that line. Well, in all that confusion and just pure horror, the men crested the top of the crater and ran down inside of it. Meanwhile, the Confederate troops who were further back this way ran to that explosion, thinking that it's on now, right? So they ran in only to find the Union had blundered and were standing in the low ground of that crater. And the Confederates commenced to turkey shoot the Union troops until there were no more. Fighting wouldn't be over with the explosion at the crater, nor would the Civil War. For that matter, neither would the siege of Petersburg. Fighting would rage on for another 9 grueling months. It would be more trench fighting, more hand-to-hand combat, more standing around. But eventually the Union Army would push through. They would take Petersburg. They would march towards Richmond. And it would be 2 months after the siege of Petersburg that Robert E. Lee would meet Ulysses Grant at Appomattox Courthouse, surrendering his sword and thus taking himself out of conflict. Well, folks, thanks for tagging along. It's been a great adventure. Nice, pleasant July. Birds, flowers, graves. So tag along with me on my next adventure. No telling what we'll get into next. So as far as this episode's concerned, it's history.